What if I told you that sometimes the moment you believe everything is over is exactly when something begins, not loudly, not in a way you expect, but quietly in a place where you stopped looking for anything new? Because that's exactly where I was, not just physically in a hospital room, but mentally in a place where I had already accepted that my life had reached its limit, that whatever chapters were meant for me had already been written. And maybe you felt that too, that kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from one event, but from everything slowly adding up until you stop expecting anything better, until hope feels unnecessary, almost unrealistic. Because for me, the hospital wasn't just a place of treatment anymore. It had become routine, predictable, a space where days blurred into each other without meaning, without change, just waiting, always waiting, and at some point, I stopped asking what I was waiting for because the answer didn't matter anymore. It was easier not to think about it, easier to move through each day without questioning where it was leading, and that's what my life had become. Not painful exactly, just empty in a way that felt permanent, like there was nothing left to discover, nothing left to feel, nothing left to change, and I had accepted that not all at once, but slowly. In small moments where I chose not to expect anything more, and over time, that acceptance turned into something heavier, something that settled inside me like a quiet conclusion. This is it. This is what my life looks like now. And maybe you've had that thought before, that quiet realization that things aren't going to change, that what you have now is all there is. And when that belief settles in, you stop noticing things. You stop paying attention to the details around you. You stop looking at people because nothing feels important enough to focus on. And that's exactly how I moved through those days, surrounded by people but disconnected from all of them. Hearing voices but not really listening, seeing movement but not really observing, because when your mind is already convinced that nothing matters, everything becomes background, and the hospital, it was full of background, doctors walking by, nurses speaking in quiet tones, machines making the same steady sounds, everything repeating in a way that made time feel like it wasn't moving at all. And I stayed in that state for longer than I can even measure now. Because when every day feels the same, you lose track of how long it's been. And that's where I was, existing but not really living, present but not really engaged, and I didn't question it anymore. I didn't try to change it. I didn't even think about what it could be instead, because thinking about something different requires belief, and belief was something I had quietly let go of. And then something happened, not dramatic, not obvious. Not something that anyone else would have noticed, but something that stood out to me in a way I couldn't explain at first, something that didn't belong to the pattern I had grown used to. Because it wasn't the environment that changed, it was my awareness of it. Because for the first time in a long time, I noticed someone not as part of the background, not as just another person passing by, but as someone who felt present. Someone who didn't blend into the routine the way everyone else did. And I remember that moment clearly, not because of anything extraordinary that happened, but because of how unexpected it felt to notice anything at all. And maybe you've experienced that moment where something small breaks through the numbness you've been living in, something that catches your attention without asking for it, because that's what it was, just a simple moment, just someone there, doing nothing that should have stood out, and yet it did, and that alone was enough to make me pause internally, because I wasn't used to that anymore. I wasn't used to noticing. I wasn't used to feeling that slight shift in awareness. And for a second, I tried to ignore it. I told myself it meant nothing, that it was just a random moment, just something my mind picked up without reason. But even as I dismissed it, something inside me didn't fully agree. Because the truth is, when something stands out in a life that has become completely predictable, it doesn't feel random, it feels different. And that difference, it stays with you, even if you try to move past it, and that's exactly what happened. Because even after that moment passed, even after everything returned to the same routine, the same silence, the same predictable rhythm, I couldn't completely let it go. Because now there was a small crack in the certainty I had built around my life, a small opening that made me aware of something I hadn't felt in a long time: curiosity. And curiosity, it's dangerous when you've convinced yourself that nothing is going to change, because it challenges that belief, it makes you question it. It makes you look again, and that's what I found myself doing, not intentionally. Not consciously, but naturally, like something inside me had shifted just enough to notice what I had been ignoring for so long. And that shift, it didn't feel big. It didn't feel like the beginning of anything, but it was. Because sometimes the smallest moment is enough to start something you never expected. And as I sat there, still in that same hospital room, still surrounded by the same environment that hadn't changed at all, I realized something that unsettled me more than anything else. Maybe my life wasn't as finished as I thought it was. And that thought alone, it changed everything. Because the moment you start questioning the end, you start opening the door to something else, and standing there in that quiet realization. I couldn't ignore the one question that had suddenly appeared in my mind. Why did he feel different from everyone else? What if I told you that sometimes it's not the person who changes everything at first? It's the fact that you start noticing them at all, because after that moment, after I became aware of him in a way I hadn't been aware of anyone else in that hospital, something inside me stayed slightly unsettled. Not in a bad way, not in a way that made me uncomfortable, but in a way that felt unfamiliar. Like a small shift had happened, and I couldn't quite return to the way things felt before. And maybe you've experienced that too, that subtle awareness that lingers after something catches your attention, even when nothing obvious has changed. Because that's exactly how it felt, like my mind had quietly stepped out of the routine it had been trapped in for so long. And now it didn't fit back into it the same way, and I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was nothing. Just a passing moment, just someone new in a place where everything felt repetitive. But even as I told myself that, I found myself noticing him again, not intentionally, not in a way I was trying to, but in the way your attention naturally returns to something that feels different. And that difference, it didn't come from anything dramatic. It came from small things, the way he moved through the space, the way he didn't seem rushed like everyone else, the way his presence felt steady, like he wasn't part of the same hurried rhythm that defined everything around me. And that steadiness, it stood out more than anything else because in a place where everything felt mechanical, where people moved with purpose but without pause, he felt different, like he existed outside of that pattern somehow. And that alone was enough to make me aware of him again, enough to make me notice things I hadn't noticed in a long time. And that awareness, it didn't feel comfortable at first, because when you've spent so long disconnected, reconnecting, even in the smallest way, feels unfamiliar. It feels like stepping into something you don't fully understand yet. And I could feel that happening slowly, quietly, like something inside me was waking up just enough to pay attention again. And as the days continued, as the routine remained the same on the surface, I realized something I hadn't expected at all. I was starting to look for him, not in an obvious way, not in a way I would have admitted even to myself, but in small, quiet moments where my attention shifted without reason, where my eyes moved through the room with a kind of awareness that hadn't been there before. And that realization, it caught me off guard more than anything else, because for so long I hadn't been looking for anything. I hadn't been expecting anyone, I hadn't been interested in what was happening around me. And now, something had changed, something small but enough to make me aware that I wasn't as disconnected as I thought I was. And that awareness, it came with questions, questions I didn't have answers to, questions I didn't even know how to ask properly, like why him, why now, why does this feel different when everything else feels the same? And maybe you've asked yourself questions like that before, when something simple carries a meaning you can't fully explain. And the truth is, those questions don't come with immediate answers. They come with more awareness, more noticing, more moments that slowly build into something you can't ignore anymore. And that's exactly what was happening, because the more I noticed him, the more I realized that it wasn't just about him. It was about what his presence was doing to me, how it was changing the way I experienced everything else, because now the hospital didn't feel exactly the same. The routine didn't feel as empty, the silence didn't feel as complete, and that difference, it mattered more than I wanted to admit, because it meant something inside me had shifted, something I hadn't planned, something I hadn't expected, something I wasn't sure I was ready for. And for a moment, I tried to pull back. I tried to convince myself that it didn't matter, that I was imagining something that wasn't really there, that it was just a distraction in a place where there was nothing else to focus on. But even as I told myself that, I knew it wasn't entirely true, because if it didn't matter, I wouldn't have noticed it in the first place. And that realization, it stayed with me, growing quietly in the background of everything else, because now it wasn't just about noticing him. It was about what that noticing meant, what it represented, what it was beginning to change inside me. And as that awareness deepened, as I allowed myself to sit with it instead of pushing it away, I realized something that unsettled me more than anything else so far. This wasn't just a random moment. This was the beginning of something I didn't understand yet, something that didn't fit into the life I thought I had accepted. And that thought alone, it created a kind of tension I couldn't ignore, because if something was beginning, then maybe my life wasn't over in the way I believed it was. And if that was true, then what else had I been wrong about? And standing there in that quiet realization, I couldn't stop one question from repeating in my mind, growing stronger with each passing moment. What would happen if I didn't ignore this? What if I told you that the moment you stop ignoring something is the moment it starts becoming real? Because up until then, everything I had felt was quiet, uncertain, something I could still dismiss if I wanted to. Something I could still convince myself didn't matter. But the truth is, the more you notice something, the harder it becomes to pretend it isn't there, and maybe you felt that too. That point where something shifts from being a passing thought into something you can't stop thinking about, because that's exactly where I found myself. Caught between wanting to go back to the quiet life I had accepted and being pulled towards something I didn't fully understand yet. And the more I tried to stay the same, the more I realized that I wasn't the same anymore. Because now I was aware of him, aware of the difference in how I felt when he was around, aware of something inside me that hadn't existed for a long time, and that awareness, it changed everything, not in a dramatic way. Not in a way anyone else would notice, but in the way I experienced each moment, because now the hospital wasn't just a place I existed in, it was a place I was observing again, noticing details, noticing patterns, noticing him. And that shift alone made everything feel slightly different, like the same environment had taken on a new layer I hadn't seen before. And that's when I realized something that unsettled me more than anything else. I wasn't just noticing him anymore, I was becoming curious about him. And curiosity, it's a step further than awareness, it asks questions. It creates interest, it makes you want to understand something instead of simply observing it. And I could feel that happening, slowly but clearly, because now it wasn't just about his presence, it was about what that presence meant. Why it felt different, why it stayed with me even after he wasn't there, and those questions, they didn't stay contained, they grew, they expanded. They pushed me into a space I hadn't been in for a very long time, a space where I cared enough to wonder, and that realization alone, it was enough to make me pause, because caring, even in the smallest way, changes everything. Especially when you've spent so long feeling nothing at all, and for a moment, I resisted it, I tried to pull back. I told myself it was unnecessary, that it would be easier to return to the version of myself that didn't notice, didn't question, didn't care. But the truth is, once something begins to matter, even slightly, you can't make it stop mattering just because it feels safer, and I knew that, even if I didn't want to admit it yet. And that's when something happened that changed everything from quiet awareness into something undeniable, because until that point, everything had been from a distance, everything had existed in observation, in passing moments, in subtle awareness that didn't require action. But then, that distance disappeared, not intentionally, not planned, just naturally, like something that had been building quietly finally reached a point where it couldn't stay distant anymore. And suddenly, I wasn't just noticing him across the room, I was near him, close enough that ignoring it wasn't an option anymore, close enough that the moment demanded awareness in a way I couldn't avoid, and that shift, it was immediate. Because when something moves from distance to presence, it becomes real in a way it wasn't before, and I could feel that reality instantly, not in anything he did, not in anything he said, but in how my awareness sharpened. How everything else seemed to fade just slightly. How that moment felt more focused than anything I had experienced in a long time, and maybe you felt that too. That moment where something simple becomes significant because of how present you are in it. And that's exactly what this was, a simple moment that didn't feel simple at all, and as it unfolded. As we existed in that same space without anything dramatic happening, I realized something I hadn't expected at all. I wasn't uncomfortable. I wasn't trying to step away. I wasn't trying to return to the safety of distance. Because a part of me, a part I hadn't acknowledged until now, didn't want to go back to that distance. And that realization, it was both surprising and unsettling at the same time. Because it meant something had already changed inside me, something that wasn't temporary, something that wasn't just a passing moment, something that was beginning to take shape in a way I couldn't control. And as that moment passed, as everything returned to the same routine on the surface, I knew one thing clearly: it didn't feel the same anymore, because now there was something real where there had only been silence before, something present where there had only been emptiness. And that difference, it wasn't going away, because once something becomes real, it doesn't disappear just because you want it to. And standing there, aware of something I hadn't planned, something I hadn't expected, Something I wasn't even sure I was ready for. I couldn't stop one thought from forming, stronger than anything before it. If this already feels different, then what happens if it goes any further? What if I told you that the moment something stops being distant is the moment it starts changing you in ways you can't ignore? Because after that first real moment where distance disappeared and presence took its place, I couldn't go back to the version of myself that had been unaffected, because now it wasn't just awareness, it wasn't just curiosity. It was something else, something that had begun to take shape without asking for permission. And maybe you felt that too, that point where something small turns into something real, where you realize you're no longer observing from the outside, you're experiencing it from within, and that's exactly where I found myself. In a place that looked exactly the same as before, but felt completely different, because now every moment carried a kind of awareness I hadn't felt in years. Every interaction around me felt slightly sharper, slightly more present. And most of all, he didn't feel like just another part of the environment anymore. He felt like something I couldn't ignore even if I tried. And that realization, it changed how I moved through everything. Because now I wasn't just existing in the hospital. I was aware of when he might be there, aware of when he wasn't, aware of the difference between those two states, and that difference, it mattered more than I wanted to admit. Because it meant something inside me had already shifted beyond control, beyond choice, into something that was simply happening. And that's when I started to notice something even more unsettling. It wasn't just about him anymore, it was about me, about how I was responding, about how I was feeling in ways I hadn't allowed myself to feel for a long time. Because for so long, my life had been quiet, controlled, untouched by anything that could disrupt it. And now that control was slipping, not in a chaotic way, not in a way that felt overwhelming, but in a way that felt unfamiliar. Like I was stepping into a version of myself I hadn't been in years, a version that noticed, that cared, that felt something instead of nothing. And that shift, it's powerful. Because it doesn't just affect one moment, it affects everything that follows, and I could feel that happening now, because even when nothing was happening, even when everything was exactly the same on the surface, there was a difference underneath. A kind of anticipation, subtle but present, like something could happen at any moment that would change everything again, and that anticipation, it's not something you can ignore because it changes how you experience time. It makes moments feel longer, more significant, more filled with possibility, and I found myself caught in that feeling more often than I expected, noticing when the day moved forward, noticing when certain moments approached, noticing things I had stopped noticing a long time ago, and that awareness. It didn't feel like something I could control anymore because it wasn't something I was choosing. It was something that had already begun. Something that was unfolding whether I fully understood it or not. And as that realization settled in, as I allowed myself to feel it instead of pushing it away, something else became clear. This wasn't just about a moment. This was becoming part of my life, part of how I experienced everything around me, part of how I saw myself. And that realization, it brought with it something I hadn't expected at all: hesitation, not because I wanted it to stop, but because I understood what it could mean if it continued. Because when something begins to matter again, it comes with risk: the risk of losing it, the risk of feeling something that might not last, the risk of stepping into something you can't control. And for someone who had spent so long living in certainty, that risk felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable, because certainty may be empty, but it's safe, it doesn't ask anything from you, it doesn't require you to take chances. But this was different. This required something from me, something I wasn't sure I was ready to give yet. And standing there, in that growing awareness, I found myself asking a question I hadn't asked in years. A question that carried more weight than anything else at that moment. What if this doesn't last? And that question, it didn't come from fear exactly. It came from understanding. From knowing that anything that feels this different has the power to change everything. And as I stood there, caught between the comfort of what I knew and the possibility of something new, I realized something that unsettled me more than anything else so far. I didn't want this to end, and that realization alone, it changed everything, because the moment you don't want something to end is the moment it truly begins. And with that thought settling deeper inside me, one question became impossible to ignore. If this is just the beginning, then how far could it go? What if I told you that the moment you realize you don't want something to end is the moment you also realize how much you've already changed? Because up until then, everything had been building quietly, step by step, moment by moment, without me fully acknowledging what it was becoming. But once that thought entered my mind that I didn't want this to end, there was no ignoring it anymore, no pretending it didn't matter. No going back to the version of myself who had accepted a life without feeling anything at all. And maybe you felt that too, that moment where something becomes undeniable, where you can't push it away anymore because it has already taken its place inside you. And that's exactly where I found myself, standing in a life that looked the same on the outside, but felt completely different on the inside. Because now everything had meaning in a way it didn't before. Even the smallest moments felt heavier, more significant, like they carried something beneath the surface that I couldn't ignore anymore. And most of all, he didn't feel like just a presence anymore. He felt like something that had become part of my experience, something that had quietly woven itself into my days without asking permission. And that realization, it's powerful because it forces you to acknowledge something you might not have been ready to admit. And for me, that acknowledgement came with something unexpected, not just awareness. Not just curiosity, but something closer to attachment. And that word alone, it carries weight, because attachment means something matters. It means something has the ability to affect you, to change how you feel, to influence how you experience your life. And for someone who had spent so long disconnected from everything, that kind of shift is impossible to ignore. And as I became more aware of it, as I allowed myself to feel it instead of pushing it away, I realized something that unsettled me more than anything else. I wasn't just noticing him anymore. I was starting to need those moments, not in a way I could explain, not in a way that made sense logically, but in a way that felt real, like those small interactions, those quiet moments of presence, had become something I looked forward to without even realizing it. And that realization, it changed everything, because the moment something becomes something you look forward to, it stops being small, it stops being insignificant. It becomes something that holds space in your life, something that shapes your days in ways you can't ignore. And I could feel that happening now, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, like something inside me was adjusting to this new reality, this new way of experiencing things. And that adjustment, it brought with it something else too, vulnerability. Because when something matters, it also has the potential to hurt, and that's something I hadn't had to think about for a long time. Because when you feel nothing, you don't risk anything, you don't lose anything, you don't open yourself to anything that could change your emotional state. But now, that was different. Now there was something to lose, something to feel. Something that could disappear just as unexpectedly as it had appeared. And that thought, it stayed with me, not as fear exactly, but as awareness, as understanding, because I knew that this wasn't something I could control. I couldn't decide how it would unfold. I couldn't guarantee that it would continue. I couldn't protect it from changing. And that lack of control, it's difficult to sit with, especially when you've built your life around certainty, around knowing what to expect, around avoiding anything that might disrupt that stability. And yet here I was in a place where nothing felt completely certain anymore, where everything carried a kind of possibility that I hadn't experienced in years. And that possibility, it was both exciting and unsettling at the same time, because it meant something could grow, but it also meant something could end. And as I stood there, caught between those two realities, I realized something that changed everything once again. I wasn't trying to go back anymore. I wasn't trying to return to the life I had before. Because a part of me, a part I couldn't ignore anymore, didn't want that life back completely. And that realization, it's powerful because it means you've already stepped forward, even if you haven't fully acknowledged it yet. It means you've already left behind the version of yourself that accepted less, that settled for silence, that avoided anything that might change things, and now, there was no going back to that completely. Because something new had already taken its place, something that had begun to shape how I saw everything. And as I stood there, aware of that shift, aware of how much had changed without me even realizing it, one thought became impossible to ignore, stronger than anything else. This wasn't just a passing moment anymore. This was becoming something real, something that had the potential to change everything if it continued. And that thought alone, it carried both excitement and uncertainty at the same time. Because if this was real, then what would happen next? And standing there, caught between what had already changed and what was still unknown, I couldn't stop one question from forming in my mind. What if this leads to something I'm not ready for? What if I told you that the moment you start wondering if you're ready for something is usually the moment it's already happening? Because by then, by the time that question had fully formed in my mind, what if this leads to something I'm not ready for? I was already deeper into it than I had ever intended to be, not through one big decision, not through some dramatic turning point, but through a series of small moments that had quietly changed everything about how I felt, how I thought, how I experienced each day, and maybe you felt that too. That realization that something has already taken root inside you before you even had the chance to question it. Because that's exactly what this was, something that had grown without asking permission. Something that had moved from awareness to curiosity to attachment and now into something even harder to define, something that carried both meaning and risk at the same time, and the more I became aware of that, the more I realized that this wasn't something I could control or manage the way I had managed everything else in my life for the past years. Because this wasn't predictable, it didn't follow a routine. It didn't stay within boundaries I understood. It existed in a space where anything could happen or nothing could happen at all, and that uncertainty, it's difficult to sit with, especially when you've spent so long building your life around certainty, around knowing what to expect, around avoiding anything that might disrupt that balance. And yet, here I was, standing in a reality where that balance had already been disrupted, where something new had entered my life in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. And that's when I started to notice something else, something even more unsettling than everything that had come before. Because it wasn't just about how I felt anymore. It was about how much those feelings had begun to matter, because now the absence of those moments felt different too. Now, when he wasn't there, when the routine returned to what it used to be, I could feel the difference more clearly than ever. Like something was missing that hadn't been missing before, and that awareness, it's powerful because it shows you exactly how much something has changed, not just when it's present, but when it's not, and that's when it truly becomes real. Because presence creates awareness, but absence creates understanding. And I understood it now in a way I couldn't deny because I could feel it, that quiet shift between what my life had been and what it was becoming. And that difference, it wasn't something I could push away anymore because it had already become part of me, part of how I moved through each day, part of how I experienced everything around me. And as that realization settled in, something else began to take shape, something deeper, something more intense, something that made everything feel heavier than before, because now it wasn't just about what was happening, it was about what it could become. And that possibility, it carried both hope and fear at the same time, because when something has the potential to change your life, it also has the potential to break it in ways you're not prepared for, and that's where the hesitation came back. Not as resistance, not as denial, but as awareness, because I knew now that this wasn't small anymore. This wasn't something I could dismiss or ignore. This was something that had already crossed into a part of my life that mattered. And that realization forced me to confront something I hadn't wanted to think about until now. What if this doesn't last? What if this ends the same way everything else has ended? What if I allow myself to feel something again, only to lose it? And those questions, they didn't come with answers. They came with tension, with uncertainty, with the understanding that there was no way to move forward without risk. Because caring always comes with risk, feeling always comes with the possibility of loss, and for someone who had spent so long avoiding that, stepping into it again felt unfamiliar, almost overwhelming, and yet, despite all of that, despite the uncertainty, despite the risk, despite the possibility that this could end just as unexpectedly as it began, there was something else that stayed stronger than all of it, something that I couldn't ignore no matter how much I tried. Something that made all the fear feel smaller in comparison. I didn't want to lose this, and that realization, it's the clearest one of all. Because when you know you don't want to lose something, it means it already matters more than you expected it to. It means it has already become part of you in a way that can't be undone easily. And as I stood there, aware of everything I was feeling, aware of how far this had already gone, aware of the risk that came with it, I realized something that changed everything once again. I wasn't standing at the beginning anymore. I was already in the middle of something I couldn't fully control. Something that had already begun shaping my life in ways I hadn't planned. And that realization left me with only one question. One that felt heavier than anything before it. If this already means this much, then what happens if I let it go even further? What if I told you that the most important moment isn't when something begins, and it isn't even when it grows, it's when you finally decide what it means to you, because after everything I had felt, after all the quiet changes that had taken place inside me without asking permission, I reached a point where I couldn't just exist in it anymore. I couldn't just let it happen without understanding where I stood. Because maybe you felt that too, that moment where something becomes too real to ignore, too meaningful to leave undefined, and you realize that staying in uncertainty isn't enough anymore. You have to decide not what will happen next, but how you will face it, and that's exactly where I found myself, not in a dramatic situation, not in some clear turning point, but in a quiet realization that carried more weight than anything that had come before it. Because now I understood something I hadn't fully accepted until that moment. My life wasn't over, not in the way I had believed, not in the way I had quietly convinced myself for so long. Because if it was, I wouldn't be feeling this, I wouldn't be questioning this, I wouldn't be standing here wondering what comes next. And that realization, it changed everything. Because it shifted my entire perspective from something ending to something continuing. And that shift alone is powerful, because when you stop seeing your life as finished, you start allowing it to move forward again, and I could feel that happening. Not just in how I thought, but in how I felt, in how I responded to everything around me, in how I no longer moved through my days as if they were just something to get through, but as something that might actually lead somewhere. And that change, it didn't come from him alone. It came from what his presence had awakened in me, something I had buried without even realizing it, something I had convinced myself I didn't need any more connection, feeling, possibility. And once those things return, even slightly, they don't leave you the same. They don't allow you to go back to the version of yourself that accepted less, because now you know what it feels like to experience something again, to notice, to care. To feel something beyond silence, and that awareness, it forces a decision, not about the future, but about yourself, about whether you will allow this part of you to exist fully again or push it back into the quiet place it came from. And standing there in that realization, I understood something with complete clarity. I didn't want to go back, not to the life where nothing changed, not to the version of myself who had stopped expecting anything more. Because even with all the uncertainty, even with the risk, even with the possibility that this might not last, it still felt more real than anything I had experienced in years. And that reality, it mattered more than fear. It mattered more than doubt. It mattered more than the safety of staying the same. And that's when the decision became clear, not in words, not in a single thought, but in a quiet understanding that settled inside me. I was going to allow this. I wasn't going to stop it before it had a chance to become something more. I wasn't going to protect myself by avoiding it, because avoiding it would mean going back to a life that no longer felt enough. And that's something I couldn't do anymore, not after everything I had felt, not after realizing that my life still had space for something new, and as that decision settled in. Something else changed too. The fear didn't disappear completely. The uncertainty didn't vanish, but they became smaller, less important than the possibility of what could come next. And that shift, it's what allows you to move forward. Not because you're certain, but because you're willing, and willingness is more powerful than certainty, because it opens the door to everything that certainty would have kept closed. And standing there, in that quiet but powerful moment of clarity, I realized something that felt both simple and life-changing at the same time. I didn't need to know where this was going. I just needed to not stop it. And maybe that's the real question this story leaves you with. The one I didn't ask myself until everything had already changed. If life gives you something unexpected at the moment you think it's over, would you hold back because you're afraid of losing it, or would you step forward and allow it to change everything? Even if you don't know how it ends.